Okay. I'm going to try real hard to keep this to 45 minutes and stop once in a while and take a breath. Yesterday, I just tried to cram too much into 45 minutes. I went 7 minutes overtime. They were flashing lights at me. Next time, they'll probably point a gun at me. But I just, and my nemesis is time, and in that lecture, I always felt like I had to say something about General Douglas MacArthur because he was in overall charge of Allied troops in his theater of war. But I always go off on these tangents, and like I was telling a few of you earlier, by the time I'm done talking about MacArthur, I look down, and I've already used up 20 minutes of my lecture. And so Robin, the whale and dolphin man, suggested, well, just take MacArthur out of it because you're going to talk about him in other lectures, and that's what I'll do the next time so that I don't go over time and then collapse afterwards. So, but this is kind of a fun lecture. This is about the home front in New Zealand. And I think the home front, I've done a lot of interviews with civilians from that generation because, well, when you think about it, when you send young men off to war, they're not the only ones that are under duress or fearful of being killed or wounded because they're leaving mothers and fathers and wives and children behind who, during the entire war, lived anxiously about whether they would see their loved ones again, and in too many instances they never did. So in some of my other lectures, you'll get a little bit of taste of this too. And this is based on the research and the oral history interviews I did for this book, New Zealand in the Pacific War. And when I was trying to put together a title, publishers never like my titles. They think they have something better, which I usually don't like. Because I wanted to title my book, New Zealand, One of Our Forgotten Allies in the Pacific War. They didn't like that. They had some piece of crap that they wanted, and I didn't like that. So anyway, we had this compromise, but we did agree on the cover of the book because there's a fellow by the name of P.G. Navarro in Galveston, Texas, and he was with the 2nd Marine Division Headquarters Company, and he did a lot of painting, sketches, and photographs of that, and his son sent me a DVD years ago with some of these on there, and I suggested to my publisher, well, why don't we take one of his paintings and use it on the cover of the book, and for once, we both agreed that that would be the ideal painting. And that's P.G. Navarro was in there. He's the guy in the khaki with his arm resting on his left knee there. And that's part of his headquarters company. So that made up the title of the book. Now, I noticed, too, that out on the board, there's something that the administration on the ship doesn't like about the word sex. So they put overfed instead of oversexed. So I hope none of you are offended by the use of that word. Okay. But this is another painting by P.G. Navarro. It's rather dramatic, but I thought, oh, that's probably, I should start off my lecture like that. And I'm going to use maps again, too, because as I said earlier, originally the Japanese, realizing that they really couldn't secure all or even part of Australia or New Zealand. They just didn't have the wherewithal. The next alternative plan was to secure Port Moresby in New Guinea. You can see the blue circle. If that succeeded, then they were going to try to seize New Caledonia, Fiji, and Pongo Pongo in Samoa. They wanted Pongo Pongo because it was had the best deep water port in that part of the Pacific. The idea was that if they could secure these 4 places, then they could control the seas and the airs around there, making it very difficult for the Americans to get troops and supplies down to New Zealand and Australia. By securing these areas, they would have to go way south to the Roaring Forties and then come over. Of course, in their attempt to take Port Moresby, they were defeated at the Battle of Coral Sea. But they didn't give up on Port Moresby because then they landed their troops on the north coast there of Papua New Guinea, a little village called Bona, and tried to march overland and seize it that way. That failed. And then, of course, with the loss of 5 of their aircraft carriers at the Battle of Midway, that really put them on their back foot. But the Allies were so concerned that the Japanese would try to seize one or more of these areas that within the first month after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there were something like 100,000 U.S. military personnel south of the equator. Some of them were National Guard troops that were sent to Australia, and then elements of the 2nd Marine Division were sent to New Zealand. That's because both countries had the majority majority of their combat troops off in the Middle East and North Africa, helping the British. Now, one of the people I interviewed was Carl Matthews of Dawson, Texas. This was during the Depression. It was a small farming community. He didn't have a lot to do except get himself in trouble until one day a Marine recruiter came to town. Carl Matthews was only 16 years old, but his parents thought, well, he's not going to find any employment, and he's getting himself in a lot of trouble, mostly because of boredom, that they signed a release allowing him to be in the Marine Corps at the age of 16. And he was part of the 5th Marine Brigade reinforced that was sent down to Pongo Pongo in January of 1942. So this is soon after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And they wanted to get them down there because they were afraid the Japanese would seize that area. And they had reason to think so, because a week before they got there, a Japanese submarine had surfaced off the coast of Pongo Pongo and shelled the little village there. So they were working overtime trying to offload their ships and get ready for a possible Japanese invasion. Of course, with all the setbacks that the Japanese had experienced there with the Battle of Coral Sea and their failure to take Port Moresby, that proved not to be necessary. And sometime during his deployment there, he came down with some undiagnosed tropical disease, and he had to be shipped home. And once he recovered, though, he's made part of the 4th Marine Division that first saw action in the Marshall Islands and then later on Saipan. But the elements of the 5th Marine Brigade, though, once they discovered, though, that the Japanese didn't have the wherewithal to take the place, they were sent to Guadalcanal when the Marines landed there in August 1942. Now, like I said, Australia and New Zealand felt the threat because the Japanese had moved so fast after Pearl Harbor, seizing Hong Kong, Singapore. They invaded the Philippines and moved swiftly down into the Dutch East Indies. By February 1942, they were bombing places like Darwin and the Northwest Territories, and there's a lot of submarine activity, especially off the East Coast. So this is a photograph of some of the Marines after they'd landed in Wellington. They had to march through town to camps that were constructed for them outside of town, at places like Paikakariki and McKay's Cross. It's not the best photo, but if you look very closely, the majority of the people watching the Marines march through are women, because most of the young men in New Zealand and Australia, they were off in the Middle East and North Africa, so there weren't a lot of young men there. Pause, take a breath. And one of the Marines I interviewed said that the women in windows in the streets, they were throwing pieces of paper at the Marines as they marched by. And some of the Marines picked up these pieces of paper and found names and telephone numbers on them. And as he said in his oral history interview, he said the female hormones were raging in New Zealand when we got there. A little bit more on that as I progress. But yeah, war may be hell, but if you're lucky enough to be a serviceman, whether you're British or American, it was party time there. And for the 2nd Marine Division, they were being sent piecemeal into New Zealand because they were scattered all over. Some were in California, I think some were even in Greenland or Iceland. They had to round them all up and get them down there as fast as they can. So there's this constant parade of Marines going through Wellington and a constant barrage of pieces of paper being thrown at them. But without any young men there, man, this was something. I mean, here's these Americans with their fancy uniforms and their fat paychecks, because they got paid more than the average Australian or New Zealanders. And New Zealanders felt so relieved to have these Americans there in case the Japanese actually tried to take the place, that they opened their homes. Everything was just open to these guys. And it was just one big party. And there were elements of the 2nd Marine Division that spent an entire 11 months there of the war before they finally had to go into combat. Now, one of the people I interviewed was Georgina Aomarera. She was 90 years old, Maori. She was, even at 90, she was sort of a shaker and mover among a number of Maoris in the area. But in her oral history interview, she just talked about the war as if it was the best thing that ever happened to her, because she was meeting all these Marines and she was being invited to parties, and she got her first Jeep ride. And she literally got glassy-eyed when she's talking about the Marines who came to New Zealand. And to quote her, she says, those Marines, they were a bit of all right. Of course, the Maori men who were still around there didn't think too highly of it. But there were any number of romances and even marriages. According to the official New Zealand history of the period, there were 1,400 war brides who went back to the United States with young Americans that they met. There was a BBC special some years ago, and the Canadians, when they came home after the war in Europe, they brought 40,000 war brides home with them. So they must have emptied the British Isles after the war was over. But I interviewed some of these people. One of them was Sylvia Whitehead. She was just a teenager at the time. And Cliff Carrington. Cliff Carrington, in his oral history, he said he grew up on the rough side of Chicago. He didn't mention who his biological father was, but apparently his mother had remarried after World War I to a German soldier, of all things. And he said in his oral history interview, when this stepfather of his got drunk, he had marched around the apartment singing Deutschland über alles. And he remembers his mother saying to this guy, though, that, yeah, well, you couldn't beat the Marines. So he got in his head that once he got out of this situation, which I gather was not a very pleasant childhood, he decided to join the Marine Corps, and he ended up as being among the 2nd Marine Division that were sent to New Zealand. And they had to keep these guys busy while they're waiting for their next assignment, and so they were spending a lot of time out in the bush on maneuvers. Now, if you've ever flown over New Zealand, it's still mostly bush. There aren't that many inhabitable areas out there. And he said there's so much bush, they went on a maneuver one time and got lost for an entire 2 weeks before they could find a village. But he also said in his oral history, they were coming back one night, and there was Sylvia Whitehead and her mother. They were walking along, and there's about 5 of them, and they just kind of saddled up to them and started talking to them and literally followed them all the way home. Say the New Zealanders of those days were a bit on the British side, a bit upper lip, and like one woman described. She says, well, if a Kiwi, if he invited you out on a date, like to go to a movie, he'd say, I'll meet you there. But he says the Marines would come to the house with chocolates and flowers and nylon stockings. A couple of cases, mink coats, but I don't know what they had to do to get a mink coat. But anyway, they literally followed Sylvia and her mother home and kind of stood there waiting to be invited in. I mean, the Kiwis just weren't used to this sort of behavior. Well, anyway, they invited him in for tea, and they lived on a small farm there. And a lot of these guys grew up on farms, so when they had time off, whether it was an evening or week, whatever, they would go over to the White House farm. They would help her father milk the cows or do whatever work was around there, and they provided basically a home away from home for these guys when they were out there, because a lot of these guys were really young kids, first time away from home. A lot of them were frightened, a lot of them were homesick. And to have these people open up their homes and give them a little semblance of what life was like before they joined the Marine Corps was really a morale booster for them. But eventually this all had to end. Sylvia and Cliff sort of developed a romance at the time. And Sylvia, in her oral history interview, said one night they were at a movie, and then the movie stopped, the lights came on, and somebody announced that all military personnel had to return to their bases. This is in lieu of them being put on ships for their first taste of combat in World War II, which was going to be Tarawa and the Gilbert Islands. Now, of course, they lost contact during the war. Sylvia just assumed that, like a lot of these guys, he was killed in action because the letters stopped coming after a while. But so when the war ended and things went back to normal, which was really quiet, in the estimation of a lot of these women that I had interviewed, they had said, well, we just have to go back to the way life was. The fun times are over. But sometime, I think it was in the late 1980s, say they both had families. Cliff, I think his marriage ended in divorce sometime in the 1980s. He had some money in his pockets. He decided to find a way to get back to New Zealand. I mean, you couldn't jump on a 747 in those days, but somehow he managed to get back to New Zealand. He went to the little town village near where the Whiteheads lived and found the numbers in the phone book and called Sylvia's house and talked to her, and she almost fainted because she thought he was dead. But he stayed there for 2 weeks. Sylvia was still married, and they just showed him around for 2 weeks, and then he went back to the United States. A year or two later, word got to him that Sylvia's husband had died. So he jumped on the next 747 Flew back to New Zealand. To make a long story short, they ended up getting married, and he spent the rest of his life living in New Zealand. John Wetzel, I think he was from Louisiana. He was part of the 2nd Marine Division. And somebody had come up with the idea of a farmstead because they had all these Americans, hanging out and going to the pubs and getting in fights. And they said, why don't we find something for them to do, because we have a manpower shortage. The women had taken over the farms. They had taken over working in certain industries that were traditionally held for the men. Because in New Zealand, Australia, like the United States and other places, back in those days, if you're a woman, you were expected to get married and raise a family. There were very few professions open to women in those days. You could be a nurse, a teacher, or maybe a secretary. But during the war, a lot of women were taking over all sorts of positions that traditionally held by men. So at the local YMCA, they had a desk there. So anybody who wanted to work on a New Zealand farm, they could. So a lot of these guys who grew up on farms thought that was a good idea. John Wetzel was one of them. He went there, and at the desk was Peggy Whiting from Eltham in Taranaki, not far from where I live. So he said, well, I hear you have these farmsteads. I'd kind of like to work on one. And I guess Peggy took an instant liking to John. He says, well, why don't you come over to my place tonight for some tea, and I'll call my father. He has a farm up in Eltham. And he said, well, thank you, ma'am, but I don't drink tea. But in New Zealand, tea is like a meal. And to make a long story short, this romance developed. They even got married while they were there. He was in New Zealand for so long that he was able to move off the base, and they had an apartment of their own. Okay? So anyway, he survived the Gilbert Islands, the Marianas Campaign, survived the war, came back to get his bride, and they moved back to Louisiana for a while, but she got homesick. So they ended up moving back to New Zealand. And when I interviewed John, he was 90 years old, and he was the last of 4 Marines who had married locals in New Plymouth, Taranaki area where I lived. So that was one romantic story I'm about to share with you. Another one was Mary Pritchard and Leslie Gershon. Leslie Gershon was a young Marine. He was 16 years old, again, another underage Marine. He became so close to Mary and her family that when he turned 17 in New Zealand, they threw a birthday party for him. And then, of course, like everybody else, he had to go off to the war after the fun times were over. They lost contact. Somewhere, I think it's probably in the 80s again, his wife had died. He was lonely. He remembered this girl he had this romantic involvement with in New Zealand. So he was computer literate and managed to locate Mary Pritchard, who just happened to be a widow. So, see where this is going. So he came over there to see her again. The romance rekindled. And so he would spend 3 or 4 months in New Zealand with her, and then she would go back to Oregon, spend 3 or 4 months with him. And this continued on for some time until his health started to fail. And, of course, they couldn't travel back and forth anymore. I stayed in contact with Marie for a while. She had eventually moved to Australia, where I think she had children she could stay with. But she would probably be close to 100 now if she was still alive, so I lost contact with her. This is Erastus Wynn Roberts from Atlanta, Georgia, on the left. And this is Joan Hay Cudby. Her maiden name was Hay. But she was a teenager then. Roberts had been wounded in Guadalcanal, was sent back to hospital in New Zealand. They somehow met up. They developed a romance that really blossomed. They were planning to get married after the war, and she was going to move back to Georgia. But then after he recovered from his wounds, he was sent back to the 1st Marine Division, and then was wounded again at Cape Gloucester, and then was sent back to the States. And without going into a lot of detail, well, their plans for the future after the war just fell apart. But then I received an email one day from this individual here in the red shirt. His father had died. His father was Roberts. And they found in the attic a shoebox full of letters written by Joan to Roberts' mother, saying about how they were planning to get married after the war and she was going to move to Georgia. And this was all a bit of a surprise to them. And then they somehow got a copy of my book about New Zealand Pacific War. And when they're reading through it, they found this photograph that I had in there of his father and Joan. So he managed to send me an email, and then he called me, and I said, well, Joan is still alive. So I gave him her phone number. He called her, And then about an hour later, I got a call from Joan saying, I just made her the happiest girl in New Zealand, because all these years, this first love of hers, she always wondered what happened to him after the war, and he was able to fill her in on the details. Not only that, he and his family came to New Zealand later and actually paid her a visit. This is Leonard Skinner. He was the 2nd Marine Division, and he was among elements of the 2nd Marine Division that actually went into Guadalcanal with the 1st Marine Division. So he fought there at least for part of the time, and then rejoined the rest of the division in New Zealand later. And he belongs to a rather unique group, because according to my research, during World War II, the 2nd Marine Division suffered 150% casualties. So to have been there from the very beginning, having survived all the way to the very end, and he was part of the occupation force of Japan. But when he came back to New Zealand from Guadalcanal, he was walking through the train station at Wellington, and there's 2 pretty girls walking this way. And being typically brash American Marines, they had to stop and talk to these girls. And they sat there and had a cup of coffee together, probably only about 15 minutes, and then they parted ways. But Leonard, in his oral history, said he remembered her saying that she lived in a little town called Ohura up in King's Country, north of Taranaki, where I live. And he decided, well, you know, I can, my time off, I can hang around here in the pubs and drink beer and all that stuff. But here's an opportunity to see something of New Zealand. In those days, New Zealand had a fantastic train system. I mean, you could go to any town or village using the train in those days. But some asshole after the war decided they were going to, pardon my language, decided to privatize the train system. So they sold it to practically gave it to a bunch of crooks. And they didn't take care of the airlines. They were selling off the stock and trying to make as much money off it until it almost ruined the thing, and the government had to buy it back from them. And to this very day, they're still trying to rebuild the railroad. But he got on a train. It took him as far as Stratford and Taranaki. That's on the other side of the volcano where I live. And he had to stay there overnight before he could take another short train from there to Ohura. So he went to a restaurant and got a meal, went to pay, and they say, hey, you Yanks don't pay, it's on us. So he checked into the hotel. Next morning he went to pay, says, no, you Yanks, it's on us, you don't have to pay for anything. He was really beginning to like New Zealand a whole lot. He got to Ohura. At the time, the population was about 3,000 or 4,000. It's mostly small family farms in the area. I mean, they had a rugby team and all sorts of stuff like any farming town. But after the war, a lot of these small family farms were sold to make big ones. So today, I think the population is only about 200 people. But anyway, he got there and he asked around for the Syrup family. He didn't announce he was coming. Yanks were like that in those days. Anyway, he just found the house, knocked on the door, and he just said, is Peggy here? And I go, who are you? I said, well, I met Peggy. We had coffee back in Wellington. And what are you going to do with the guy? So they invited him. He ended up staying there for 2 weeks. And whenever he got leave, he'd always go back to O'Hare because they had kind of adopted him. And so he had a place to go. It was sort of like a family away from the one he had back in the States. And they stayed in contact throughout the war. But he went back to the States afterwards, got married, raised a family. Peggy did the same thing. But they stayed in contact. And then get into the 60s, they started paying each other visits. His family would come to New Zealand and visit with Peggy's family. Her family go over to Oregon where he lives and visit them. Their children got to know each other and exchange visits. Their grandchildren. To this very day, I think we're into the 4th generation, all because of that cup of coffee in the Wellington train station. They are still in contact. And they also took in a lot of the sick and wounded. I mean, people were coming back there in the hospital. They were wounded. A lot of them had malaria, dengue fever. And with malaria, if you know, you get it once, you can have recurring bouts of it. One of them was John Place. He was in the Marine Corps on Guadalcanal. He came down with malaria. And this family from Eltham, Darcy and Dallas Nucky, I think they were 93 and 97 respectively when I interviewed them. But they had a farm in Eltham too, just like Peggy Whiting, and they took in John Place. But he had malaria so bad, even in the summer months, he would sit in front of the fireplace wrapped in blankets. But Nari Baker lived nearby, and she'd like to come over to the Nucky farm and ride their horse. And that's when she met John Place. And another typical story where they fell in love. They had plans for after the war, but then the war he ended up getting wounded or something again in future battles, and they never got back together. But I keep hearing these stories, especially from New Zealand women, about their first great romantic experience of life was with some American servicemen. And for some reason, I kept thinking of something that Bertrand Russell said in his autobiography. How many people have heard of Bertrand Russell? Yeah, he was a well-known mathematician and philosopher going all the way back to the late 19th century. When I was going to school in Santa Barbara in the 1970s, he was still alive. He was 97 years old. But he said something in his autobiography that kept coming into my mind when I was hearing those stories. I'm not sure how well it's connected, but in his autobiography, he said, once a woman discovers that the man of her dreams is in love with her, she no longer has any use for him. I've gotten a lot of trouble from women in the audience by quoting Bertrand Russell. So I happened to think, well, there was this female philosopher who said something once. I try to balance things out so I don't get lynched after my lecture. Actually, she was a comedian. But comedians, in a sense, can be philosophers. I'm thinking of, who was that one who died not too long ago? George Carlin? If ever there was a comedian come philosopher, it'd be George Carlin. But she said, most men are looking for the perfect woman, someone who will leave them alone. Am I okay now? Okay. Now, there were problems with race relations because a lot of these guys from the South or even maybe from the North, the U.S. military was segregated. And but at a certain point when the Americans was there, some of the New Zealanders were coming back on furlough because they'd been away for over 3 years, some of these guys. What they found when they came back was not too good because all the women were hanging out with the Americans because they had the money and the fancy uniforms and they would take them out and bring chocolates and flowers and nylon stockings and stuff like that. So there were a lot of alcohol-fueled punch-ups, even riots down in Wellington. And in Australia, the same thing happened. Anybody ever heard of the Battle of Brisbane? Well, this is when Australian troops were coming on this way and American troops were going that way, but they had different gauge railroads, so they had to stop, and they were going to switch trains. Well, the Americans started yelling at the Australians how they were taking all their women. Well, then that just started a riot, and shots were actually fired between the two sides. A couple of people actually got killed. So, and you get into New Zealand, though, some of the men from the Maori battalion were coming back on furlough, too. And when some of these Americans treated the Maori the way African Americans were being treated at the time, that really caused a ruckus. So they had to find some way of mitigating this. One guy interviewed said that they got a bunch of New Zealand and American troops, and they had to line up and count off, and then they went into a stadium where they were going to put on some Maori song and dance or whatever. And but they had to sit New Zealander, American, and then they were forced to turn to each one and introduce themselves. So they would get to know each other a little bit and not go out and beat each other up afterwards. And then there's this a Maori princess, Tupue, and she's the one that organized a lot of Marae visits for the U.S. military there, so they could get to know Maori as human beings. And a lot of these Maoris would take in some of these soldiers, just like families did, and give them a home away from home. So that helped really ease some of the tensions that were going on at that time. This fellow here on the right, that is Norm. What is his last name? Norm. God, I forgot his name. Anyway, he was a Marine Corps cinematographer. He had been in the Marine Corps before Pearl Harbor. He was with President Roosevelt and his family down in Warm Springs, Arkansas, where he used to go to take the waters because he had polio. So he knew the president. He knew his wife and some of his entourage. But he was sent over with the 2nd Marine Division, and he would go around and just film the Marines when they were out on maneuvers or what they were doing in town. They were even invited, I guess, Napier and Hastings on North Island, East Coast. They weren't seeing many of these Americans, and they wanted to see some. So they invited elements of the 2nd Marine Division up there one Christmas and just opened the town to them. They didn't have to pay for anything. They had free cinema. Families took them in while they were there. They had a really great time. And while he was up there, he also visited some of the marae around Lake Taupo and Rotorua and got to know some of them. And this is a photo. His name is Norman Hatch. Anyway, he got to know some of the Maori there, And he said he was talking to one high-ranking Maori princess there, and she was complaining about, she was getting word back from her husband and some of the boys from the Maori battalion were really enjoying themselves with some of the Egyptian women that they were meeting over there in North Africa. So, when they talk about Americans being oversexed, overpaid, and over here, and, it wasn't just the Americans. You got a lot of young men who are away from home probably for the first time. They're exploring new parts of the world. And, they weren't all going to church on Sunday. They were going out and looking for a good time. So the situation is, okay, yeah, the Americans had this reputation, but you don't hear that much about some of the other forces from other countries and what they were doing when they were away from home where mom and dad couldn't see what they were doing. So anyway, but he went to Tarawa with the 2nd Marine Division. He and I think one or two other cinematographers filmed all the film footage that you'll see. If you go to the History Channel and you look at any archival footage about the Battle of Tarawa, it was filmed by Norm Hatch and his crew. I mentioned the farm stay, and it worked quite well. Here's this beautiful young New Zealand woman. She's probably trying to run the farm and raise the kids all by himself. And then you got all these American servicemen out there helping out. And it worked pretty well. And this is Ike Watts. He was from Ohio. He was a farmer up there, lived there all of his life. He was part of the militia. And when World War II started, he went to report to his unit because he thought he was going to be called up on active duty. But they said, no, you're a farmer. That's essential industry. Whether you're in the United States or New Zealand or other places, if you're a farmer, there was a good chance that they wouldn't even let you in the military because it was so important to produce all the foods necessary not only to feed the armies and navies of the world, but also the civilian population. So he spent the whole war, the war farming. He didn't have to go off to combat. This is Stan Martin. He was in the New Zealand Navy, but back in those days, being part of the Commonwealth, you could be in the New Zealand Navy but serve on Royal Navy ships, and that's what he did throughout the war. He served on 2 different Royal Navy ships, the last one being a Royal Navy aircraft carrier that was part of the British Pacific Fleet during the last year of the war. But see, after the war, starting in the 1960s, I think it was, the 2nd Marine Division Association started having their reunions every 5 years in New Zealand because that was their home away from home during the war. They all have very fond memories of New Zealand and the families who took them in and the Marais that took them in and the girls they fell in love with. So anyway, somehow he got connected with them. And so every year before they would have the reunion in New Zealand, they would write to him and say, can you help me find this family? Can you help me with this? Oh, there's this girl I used to go out with. Is she still around? And he would help them. And some of these guys came back, and some of them ended up marrying their old girlfriends from the war. And he was so important to what they did, they made him and his wife honorary members of the 2nd Marine Division Association. Yeah, so he was not only with him every 5 years, him and his wife started going back to the States every year to the reunions. So there was another connection there between New Zealand and Australia. This is Silver Stream Hospital. There are a number of hospital and clinics and other facilities that were built by the U.S. military in New Zealand. Silver Stream was meant to house the sick and wounded who were coming back primarily from the Solomon Islands. But what I learned from my research is that after the war, they simply turned all of these structures over to New Zealand to do as they saw fit. Some of them, I understand, were turned into schools. Now, I gave this lecture some years ago, and there were 2 retired New Zealand nurses in the audience, and they came up afterwards, and they said back in the 1970s, they worked at Silver Stream Hospital, and it's still being used as a hospital by the New Zealand government back in the 1970s. But there are also a number of unplanned pregnancies and hushed-up abortions. Now, in those days, to have a child out of wedlock was a real stigma. So some of these women that I interviewed who elected to keep their children, they moved from wherever they were living, usually to a large metropolitan area such as Christchurch or Auckland, where they would become anonymous. Almost all of them ended up marrying somebody local after the war, but the idea was that the child would be adopted by her new husband, and there would be no record kept of his biological father. That's how severe it was back in those days. Others, they decided to give their babies up for adoption. And Wynn Stockwell worked at Wellington Hospital during the war. She said they had a special ward where women could drop off their babies, and then they would be there to be adopted by New Zealand families. Now, even before I started working on my book about New Zealand Pacific War, I was making a lot of inquiries, and people were telling me, "Oh, well, my wife's father was a U.S. Marine, but we don't know what happened to him." I was hearing stories like this all along. So even before I started my book, I decided I was going to have a section of the book dedicated to what I call the children left behind. So I've interviewed a number of people. I'm only going to share a couple of stories here with you. But here on the left is June Bodne Tarangi. She describes herself as a Cook Island Maori. Her mother was working as a domestic in Wellington during the war, fell in love with the Marine, got pregnant by him. He went off the war. They never saw him again. But she elected to keep the baby, and the baby was June. But it was hush-hush. She wasn't supposed to know about this because her mother married after the war, and June always thought this guy was her father. But she was a teenager when they were at some family gathering, and one of her relatives, for whatever reason, blurted out, "Well, your real father was a U.S. Marine." Well, her whole life changed after this. It was such a shock to her. When I interviewed her in the Cook Islands some years ago, she was still obsessed with trying to find out who her biological father was. And as far as I know, she never did. Shirley Winnestofer was a similar situation. Her mother got pregnant by a U.S. Marine, and then he had to go off the war, never came back. And there's again a similar situation. She was a teenager, and one of her aunts said, "Well, your father was a U.S. Marine." Shirley's mother was so upset with Shirley's aunt that she would refuse to talk to her for another 10 years. She was so upset about that. But then she became obsessed too. Well, who was my father? Why didn't he come back? All these questions. All these people have these same questions. Does he know I exist? Is he still alive? Why didn't he come back? All these people I interviewed had these same questions. It bothered them for the rest of their lives. Well, her brother said, one of her brothers, well, let's put it this way. She had 3 step-brothers, but she didn't know they were her step-brothers until she found out that they were from another biological father. She says, "I grew up thinking there's something wrong here because I don't look like any of them." So her brother said, "Well, the 2nd Marine Division Association is going to be coming back next year. Maybe we can meet up with some of them and see if they can help." But she had no letters, no photographs of her father, nothing, because that was part of the deal. You got rid of all that stuff, okay? So they met some of them, and there was one Marine. And she says, "All I can tell you is that he had a nickname of Duke, which suggested he got in a lot of fights." And he says, "I knew somebody by the name of Duke." He says, "When I get home, I'll make an inquiry." A couple weeks later, a letter arrived in the mail. Shirley opened it, and this photograph fell out. The letter writer said, "I am your uncle. This is your father. He's from Belady, Missouri. He knew about you, and he stayed in letter contact with your mother for about 4 years, but we come from a very poor family in a very poor community. He was never able to get back there." And so because of that, Shirley, who had never been out of New Zealand, never been on an airplane, saved her money, got a passport, flew to Belady, Missouri, and had a family reunion with about 70 people there. And she said in her oral history interview, she says, "They all look just like me." Must have been a little bit of inbreeding there, maybe. I don't know. Anyway. But the sad thing was that her father had died 8 years earlier. But at least she knew who her father was, and she got to meet all of her aunts and uncles and cousins, and some of them actually came to New Zealand eventually to visit her. So at least she knew who her father was. Okay, Alfred Leach, similar situation, found out as a teenager that the guy he called his father was not his biological father. It's kept secret from him. He was so upset about it that when I found out about it, it took me 6 months trying to convince him to sit down with me so I could record his oral history, because it still upset him that much. So I got his oral history, but the last time I saw him, he still didn't know who his biological father was. Now, this is Robert Clinton Libby. He's the little boy there. His father was in the U.S. Marine Corps. he grew up in foster homes. He doesn't know who his father was. I'm not sure he even knew who his mother was. So he joined the Marine Corps just to get away from a very miserable childhood he had. And while he was in New Zealand, he fell in love and married the lady you see on the right. And when he was getting ready he survived the war. He survived Tarawa, the Marianas Campaign. He came back to take his bride home. And she says, well, I don't want to leave my family. And he says, well, I don't have a family back in the States either, so I might as well stay here. So he was one of any number of U.S. servicemen who ended up spending the rest of their life in New Zealand. And at least he grew up knowing who his father was. Now, I talked a little bit about the Wharfies because the 1st Marine Division was sent to New Zealand originally. They were there to prepare and train for the landings in Guadalcanal, which was supposed to take place in August. But the Japanese were getting very close to finishing the airfield on Guadalcanal, and Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, decided we're just going to have to move up that operation a little bit early because if they finish that runway, then they're going to bring in planes and it's going to be much more difficult to seize the island. So they had to combat load their ships in a hurry. They tried to get the wharfies, or longshoremen, as you call them in the States, but they had a very powerful union, and they had these clauses in their contracts. Says they didn't have to work on their birthday, they didn't have to work when it rained. And if you've ever been to New Zealand, it rains about 300 days out of the year, so I don't know how work they got. So they, and General Vandegrift argued with, look, they're in a wartime situation and we need to have these combat loaded and we need help, and they refused to do it. Oh, I'm almost done. Okay. So they had to do it themselves. And General Vandegrift in his autobiography had very unkind things to say about the Wharfies. But it wasn't just that way in New Zealand, because in Australia and the United States we had very strong unions, and with good reason. But the coal miners went on strike in the U.S., and same thing in Australia. Prime Minister John Curtin actually negotiated with the striking coal mine workers, saying, look, we've got to resolve this right away because you're slowing down the war effort. So that's what the mess they ended up with and on trying to get to Guadalcanal. Now, I also interviewed a Marine who'd been on Guadalcanal, and he says when they were relieved by the Army and they were loaded aboard ships, they thought they were going to just another island to fight more Japanese. And when they rounded the heads in Wellington, saw there was a modern city there, they realized that they were going to at least have a bit of a respite before having to go into battle again. So some of these guys literally broke down and started crying because they were convinced that they were going to go off and have to fight in some jungle battle again. And these guys were skin and bones. I mean, a lot of these guys had come down sick with malaria, dysentery, and other tropical diseases. They hadn't had a real decent meal. They had seen no dairy products in something like 6 months, some of these guys. And it just so happened, when they were getting off the ships in Wellington, there was a guy who was getting ready to deliver milk and other dairy products to families around Wellington. I mean, I remember when I was a kid in California, they used to deliver milk to the front steps. Some of you probably remember that too. Well, they stopped the guy and took all of his milk and cream. And they paid him. They just threw, because they had all this back pay, they were throwing money. This guy made a bundle. So he didn't have anything to deliver to the families in Wellington, so he went out and got some more, but he didn't deliver it to the families in Wellington. He came back and sold it to the Marines at a nice profit. Well, there's also a problem with desertion, because a lot of these guys had been there for so long and had such a good time. Some of them had married, but they had adopted families there. But when it was time to go off and fight the war, there were a certain number of them decided they'd rather stay in New Zealand. It seemed like a much better lifestyle than going off and getting shot at on some jungle island. So going through old newspaper articles, there's these articles about how the U.S. military police and New Zealand civil authorities are going around trying to round these guys up and get them back to their outfits. And in the process, they found a guy who had jumped ship in New Zealand 25 years earlier. Apparently, he had arrived with maybe it was after World War I or something, in an American fleet stopped in New Zealand. He went ashore on Liberty and said, I think I'll just stay here. So he stayed there. It was 25 years later, and he got arrested. So anyway, But the good times were over because in November, they were loaded up and they were sent off to their first taste of combat for a lot of them. It turned out to be Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands. And the 2nd Marine Division alone, in 3 days of fighting, had 3,000 casualties. 1,000 of them were KIA. That's more Marines. They lost more Marines in 3 days than the Marines lost in Guadalcanal after several months of fighting. And this is where they ended up, on Tarawa. So, a sad ending to an otherwise wonderful war. Anyway, I got done with 2 minutes to spare, so I hope the guys in the booth are happy.